I'm Wendy Ohlson, and I'm currently head of the virtual school in Devon, which is the organisation that has responsibility for the education provision for young people and children in care. So I've only been doing that since January. Previous to that, I was in the virtual school, but in the role of what we call an area learning advocate. So I had a cohort of children that were my responsibility. And then previous to that, 2 years before that, I'm actually a teacher. I'm a secondary school teacher, and I'd been a deputy head in a large secondary school where I worked largely in the area of safeguarding child protection and was the designated teacher for children in care. So I've always had a passion and a belief that these children needed a different approach, something a little bit more than the everyday child who lives at home in their family, and wasn't really intending to leave my job. And I saw the job in the virtual school and thought, haha, that sounds interesting, and got involved. And then I now seem to be the person who's heading it up. So lucky me. So yeah, it's good. So we currently have 870 young people on our school roll. About 600 of those are children that are in care to Devon. So they're Devon children that come into care. We also have an oversight of children who are in care to other local authorities but are placed in Devon. So we're not as involved with them, but we support schools and social workers that are not in the county with best provision for them. So keeps us busy. Yeah, to be honest, I didn't know what a virtual school was, and I've taught in Devon for 30 years, and I always thought it was some sort of online tutoring company. But so every local authority has a statutory duty to have a virtual school. How you organise your virtual school in your local authority is then up to each authority to decide. And the purpose of the virtual school is to add an advocacy role and an overview of the provision for all children in care from the ages of 3 to 18, wherever their education might be taking place. So it's recognised that that cohort of young people need more than other young people that might be at school. So in Devon, we've organised it with a head teacher, which is the only job that you have to have. And then we have 4 members of staff we call area learning advocates. So they take a quarter of Devon each. And so they have a cohort of a quarter of the children, and they work with schools, with social workers and carers to make sure that the young people are attending school, that the school provision meets their need, that they are having regular personal education meetings where we write a personal education plan. So all children in care have a plan 3 times a year. And we also take a part in local authority wider role in with social care at looking at placement moves for children and then having to source education wherever they go. So it's everything to do with educational opportunities for that cohort of looked after children, from making sure that they've got the right aspirational targets, that they've got good transition from primary to secondary, from key stage 3 to 4, from the end of secondary into post 16 education, that they're going to go to university if they can possibly go to university, that schools are really aspirational for those children, down to have they done swimming lessons? Do they want to learn to ride a bike? Would they like to join a music group? So in a way, being part of that corporate parenting role, so that we are trying to provide all the opportunities with social care that a child living in a family would have, and really supporting foster carers, because sometimes they are different with their fostered children than they were with their own children. They don't want to have a conflict with them, so they don't encourage them to do their homework or to get out their reading book. And we're trying to say, well, you wouldn't do that. Would that have been good enough for your own child? No, so let's do it differently for this child. So it's everything to do with promoting learning and education and well-being, really, for that cohort of children. Well, obviously it's really relevant because there's not a single child that we deal with who hasn't had an adverse childhood experience of some kind. Some have had more than anybody could even think about in a lifetime, um, and of different kinds. So it's right at the heart of what we're doing in understanding that the impact that that early childhood experience, or even if it happens in teenage, how that is going to impact on their capacity to move through childhood and then have a successful adult life. And a big part of what we do is also working with schools and colleges to understand that impact so that they provide a different way of working, we hope, with their whole school cohort. So we run quite a lot of projects which are helping schools to understand trauma and attachment, to work in much more of a relational way, and to remove the sort of punitive behaviour systems that we might have in our schools. So we commission a lot of training and a lot of events for teachers, senior managers, to try and take that different approach. So it is absolutely at the heart of what we're doing, which is why we wanted to be involved in the project. And I was lucky enough to go to Sweden for one of the exchange meetings, and it was amazing. The thing that I took away from that were two things, actually. One was that they have no concept in Swedish education system of excluding a child, which was just like, oh my goodness, this is amazing, because sadly in the UK that is something that happens a lot, and it happens more for children in care than it does for non-children in care. Most of our children, well, not most, I can't remember the percentage, but it's a high percentage of children in care have had at least one fixed term exclusion from school. Whereas the school in Sweden, when we asked them about that, couldn't really understand what we were saying. Why would anybody say that a child can't come to school? There's always a solution to something that the child is, and it just seems to be so intrinsic in the understanding of children that we came back feeling quite energized, but then quite how on earth will we get anyone here to really understand that? So that was one big thing that came out of that visit. The other was the concept of the post-16 provision for children was totally seamless. So when young people finished their high school time, they all moved to the same establishment. So whereas in the UK, you get to the end of year 11 and some people will be going off to sixth form in their school, some will be going to college, some will be doing an apprenticeship, some will be doing a vocational course at college or whatever. This just wasn't like that. And so nobody felt inferior or superior. Everybody moved to, I can't remember what they called it, the college, the post-16 provision. And within that college, there were then these mini schools. So it was so inclusive, and they didn't have a problem with young people becoming neat, because they didn't have all these decisions to make about where they were going to go. They just went to the college, and that was what happened for everybody. And within that college building, there was a section for students who had quite complex learning needs. So they didn't go to a special school, they went to college with everybody else. And it felt just so obviously the right thing to do that it made us want to come back and start our education system in the UK from scratch again, and just say, why do we divide up? Well, no, it is very divisive, really. And sometimes within years 10 and 11 of a school experience, a young person can feel quite, oh, well, I'm not going to sixth form, I'm going to do so and so. And there was none of that. And that their NEET rate was really, really, really low. Between end of year 11 and year 12, everybody had a progression path. So that was something really strongly that we took away, thinking we need to try and bring some of that learning back to the UK. We haven't changed the world yet, but we're on a mission to. So yeah, it was really, really quite interesting, actually. What it does is it reinforces that a lot of the negative feelings that a young person or child already has about themselves, and it if it leads to a permanent exclusion from school, that's another rejection for a child, that they feel that they haven't been something that where they haven't been successful. And often then the next step in the UK is quite negative. So if a child is permanently excluded from school, they often will go to a pupil referral centre here, which often do not have positive role models around that child because the other children are also in that position. The outcomes for children that are permanently excluded are very low. They don't tend to go on, if they're out of school for too long, out of mainstream school, to get good positive GCSE outcomes. And it reinforces all the negative things around relationships and being part of a community. And for our children in care particularly, to me it's often a lack of understanding and a lack of being able to put in a different way of dealing with behaviour that is unacceptable to the school, because poor behaviour is often just an expression of where that young person is at that time, and it might be because of things that have happened in their past, something triggers, or they don't have those stop buttons that other children have. Something we are noticing in UK schools is that the behaviour policies are quite rigid, and they're quite unwielding. They don't make allowances quite often for a young person's additional situation and their past. It can be really difficult for schools to manage. So, but it doesn't really solve anything. The evidence doesn't show us that children who have one or two fixed term exclusions then suddenly don't do that behaviour anymore. It doesn't work, does it? So it's just not a very positive way of dealing with anyone. When I was working in school, obviously we would have um, sometimes I think probably the worst one was two little girls who we had no idea that anything had happened in their family, and they came to school every day, they did all their work, they were clean and tidy, they were delightful little girls, and they came in one morning really early in the morning and came into my room and both sat down and said, "We're really hungry." And when we began to unpick their life, they had the most terrible history of neglect and incidences of domestic violence in their family home, mum consuming a lot of alcohol, and they had really managed their home life and school life in compartments, and then suddenly it just blew off the top. And I think I felt probably so guilty that I hadn't realised that this had been going on. So you can get that kind of thing that you don't know about, and you can't do anything about it because there are no signs. Then you get other signs where you might see a young person who changes in their presentation, and they might have been really positive, really, attending really well, and then their demeanor changes and their outlook, and then you can unravel what's going on. Within the current role, within the virtual school role, we see a lot of young people who've got a lot of difficulties around containing their anger. They're very dysregulated very quickly, and that's often linked to living in a very turbulent, very violent home when they're very young. We've got a couple of children who are who don't have much language, so language is often impeded, especially in the very young children if they've not been stimulated or played with, and they've had dietary deficit, they're often not developing terribly well. We have about 35% of our children in care have an educational healthcare plan because they have some developmental delay, or they have just additional learning needs that are related back to their childhood experiences. We have a number of children who present as quite provocative and quite difficult, particularly around girls, around men, if they've had sexual adverse experiences when they're little, or they've been exposed to sexual harm when they're small. So it is just vast, really. But all the children that we currently work with have had something, and that the way in which it displays itself shows in a whole wide range, some in a very introverted behavior, some in very extrovert behavior. We have a lot of self-harm, which we see. We've had just this morning, one of our older students has tried to take his life today, and a lot of that is around feeling worthless and feeling rejected by his family. And actually, we thought he was doing quite well, and he's 17, and I think, sometimes the reality of reaching the end of that formal period of care and coming out the other end is a big time for our young people, where they suddenly think, gosh, who's there for me now then? That can be really, really difficult. So there is no doubt that that's what we're working with all the time, is the results of those childhood experiences. And I did a part of a master's degree last year, and one of the topics that I chose to write about were the pre-birth traumas and ACEs for later care experienced children. So looking at impact of ACEs on the unborn child, which was fascinating for me, because although we know that unborn babies can react to sound and stress, and to actually find so for many of our children, those experiences will have been accumulating from conception, really. And but there is hope. There is hope that for newborn babies who've suffered from pre-birth stress, that can be repaired. And that's kind of what we're all trying to do. We're trying to repair the damage and the impact of those ACEs for our children and young adults, so that they can go on to have successful adult lives. I think I can only really talk from the school perspective, and I'm thinking of our current work in the virtual school. The thing that seems to make the biggest difference is a positive relationship in a school with at least one person. If that young person has someone that they feel they can trust and rely on, and regardless of what they do not let them down. That's the thing, and they test and test and test to see. We had a boy who, when I first met him, I think he'd already been in 4 foster placements, and his experience was that you go into a foster placement but actually at some point they give notice on you. They don't keep you, although they say this is your forever home. They don't really keep you forever. And so he'd kind of bounced around to various homes and then moved to a new foster placement. And they said, we are having him forever. He was 10 at the time. And he did everything in his power to test that out, you know, from trashing his room to refusing to eat pretty much anything but pizza, being horrible to their existing 2 children. And they kept him and they kept him and they kept him. And they didn't ignore the things that he did, but they talked it through and they were consistent and clear and just loved him and stuck with him. And I remember his foster carer telling a tale about how he used to come in from school every night and they had a kind of long sideboardy table thing in their living room, and he'd go straight to the table and she had lots of family photos on there, and he used to rearrange all the photo frames. So one day he'd put their granddad at the front and the children at the back, and he'd play for ages with these photo frames. And one day when he was at school, she put his photo into a frame and put it on the sideboard. And when he came in, he started doing, and he stopped and he picked up this photo and he said, I'm not in your family. Why am I on the sideboard? And she said, well, I keep telling you you're in our family. And it changed. And he's still in that family, and he is kind of beginning to trust. It's to do with trust, really, and having been let down so many times that it was a really good, it's simple example of, because I think if she'd put his photo on the sideboard in the first week of him being there, it would have had, he's not part of the family at that point, but it was a big statement for him that he was staying, he was part of it. And although he was a little toad sometimes and he tried their patience, they were not going to give up on him. They were having him in their family. So I think the thing that makes the difference is working in a really relational way with our young people. And sometimes that's really hard because they can be really unpleasant and difficult. And it's hard sometimes not to say, hang on a minute, let's not swear and but it's about being there and being consistent, being clear and sticking with them, really trying to make it work. And I think sometimes as well, it's also about believing in their potential, which is what we spend a lot of time doing. We try to get schools to do that and to be really aspirational for those children. Sometimes I think out of kindness, schools and foster carers think, oh, isn't it amazing? They're coming to school every day and they're bringing a pen and it's all great. That isn't enough. They wouldn't accept that from other children. And I read an article from an adult who had been a child in care, and she completely described that, the feeling that when she was quite a high flyer at school, and when she went into care and moved school, they seemed to celebrate the fact that she had shoes and uniform on. And she said, so I just sank to the lowest denominator I could get away with until she had a new history teacher. And she said, I didn't know whether the history teacher didn't know I was in care or was just trying to do the best for me. And she told her that she was a lazy little so-and-so and she needed to work a lot harder because she was capable of going to university. And she said it was like the lights came on, that somebody recognised that I was able to do a lot more. And she's now working for a big financial company in London and absolutely flying. And she still put it down to that history teacher. So I think it's about, only takes one person to inspire that child and make that child or young person feel. And we all like that, don't we? We all like to think that our parents won't give up on us, even though we do some pretty dull things, and that there is a teacher. Quite often, if I'm doing training with, I do quite a lot of training with trainee teachers, and I get them to think of a teacher that made a difference for them. And they don't remember the lessons that they taught them. They don't remember the worksheets and the marking that they spent hours on. They remember the way they made them feel. The fact that they felt good in that, they felt relaxed and comfortable in their lessons, that they were able to talk to them. So whether that puts people off being a teacher or not, if it does, then good, because you need to be a people person, not just an academic, really. Many of them have actually really flourished in school because they've had much smaller classes, they've had much more individual attention, schools have been much more relaxed, they've often not had all the rules. They've had the COVID bubble rules, but lots of schools you haven't had to wear school uniforms, so you haven't had that. Why have you got black socks on when the rules say you've got to wear grey socks, and all those finicky things that can get in the way. So many of I would say the vast majority of our children in care, the lockdown has been quite a positive experience, particularly for younger children, where their carers have established, in the first lockdown when there was no school, they established quite really good routines at home and learning. In the second, so in the spring lockdown after Christmas, we were able to encourage, we had about 75% of our children in care that were attending school. And the others, we had a really clear protocol that they should be at school unless they had a good reason. So in some cases, if they had their own medical issues, then they probably wouldn't be going, or if the carers were shielding, or all sorts of things. So for those that did attend, the lockdown was really positive. And we had so many meetings and things in the local authority preparing for all this extra anxiety and mental health breakdown, and it didn't really happen. The bit where I think the lockdown and the pandemic has had a really negative impact on children with ACEs is those children who are not yet in care. So for children who are on child protection plans, children who are on child in need plans, they're still living in those family homes. Yes, they've got a social worker attached to them, but they are still in that environment, in probably a much tighter environment, because they might not be going out and doing the things, or a parent might not be at work, so there's additional stress. And talking to schools, that is where their concerns have been. They haven't been so concerned about our children because they're in, assessed foster homes. They've got all eyes on them all the time. And they were also very concerned about those that hadn't yet made it onto the social care radar. So they might be at early help level, they might even not be there. They might be like the girls I spoke about earlier who were managing. And I can't imagine how they would have coped if they hadn't had school and they hadn't had that contact outside of the family home. So it was for those where there was either an unrecognised need, or schools knew there was a need, but it wasn't enough that it didn't meet thresholds for things. And for many of those children, that was really, we did have a really big increase of children coming into care. We had about 19% increase in the summer, and that was the result of those children that had been child in need and child protection, and then during the lockdown, all those additional stresses and pressures on a family. Then that did mean we had a lot of children that came into care. But for our particular cohort of children in care, if anything, the first lockdown, it seemed to bring people together. And then in the second one, a lot of them report that they made lots of new friends because they were in school with people that they wouldn't normally have mixed with. Many of the older ones didn't go, but the 25% that didn't go to school were largely year 10s and 11s. And that was because they don't want to go to school without their friends. You know, they're not going, and it made them feel different, that they were a child in care and they had to go. But for that group where ACEs were still a daily reality and they were living in those difficult family situations, the lockdown was pretty awful, which did result in them coming into care. So that was feedback that we got from schools, that it wasn't children in care particularly. I think actually going back to the lockdown, the pandemic period, actually we've worked together better. And I think we have to be a team around a child. If we're just going in saying, this is what we think about education, it is not going to work. And if social care are just going in saying, this is where the child has to live, then that isn't going to work. And so we always kind of knew we needed to do that a lot better. And we both understand each other's place, that, you know, a placement breaks down and that child has to have a new home. But there didn't used to be very much consultation between us and social care. Whether it's because we have been working virtually, maybe it's been a lot easier to get together. At the very beginning of the pandemic, the local authority set up, they called them incident management groups, which sounded a bit like there'd been a terrorist attack or something, but they were around different. So I was part of the one that was around the children in care, just the day-to-day managing of what might come along. And that was a really wide group of different agencies, different professionals. So we had police and health, social care, myself, youth offending team. Oh, so many different agencies. And we met once or twice a week to look at just any intelligence that we had around what was going on with the cohort of children. And so establishing that group became really close and would refer to each other much more than they would have done previously, when we might have tried to catch each other, or we would have emailed each other, but you didn't really know the other person. So one of the lessons I think in interprofessional working has been around knowing who the people are that you can go to and establishing groups. It always works so much better if they're real people that you think, oh, I'll give so and so a quick ask about that. And we've vastly improved relationships between social care and education. So now when young people are moving, we are consulted right at the beginning. Even so, we've got with the social care have established some new working practices around moving children. And so one of the things they're trying to do at the moment is to get all their under 12s out of residential care and into families. And so, but instead of just saying, let's put out placement searches, because some of those children have got quite complex education needs, they've been able to say to us, where in Devon would be the best place for this child to live? And we've been like, hooray! And so we've been much more joined up in our thinking around what would be the best all-round package for that child. So we've been able to say, well, they've got this need and this need, this would be the best school. Can you see if you can get a placement? And it's not easy, because the sufficiency of placements is a real problem. So I think we've learned lessons that having an established group of professionals who know and trust each other and commit to meeting to look at the wider picture, we've carried that on now. We're not going to get rid of that group, and sometimes we meet and say there isn't much today, it's 10 minutes and we all go away. Other times we might be there for 2 hours. If there was a really nasty incident that happened in one of the small towns on the coast, and we were fearful that it was a racially motivated incident, and one of our unaccompanied asylum seekers was injured in the incident. And it was great that we had a ready-made place to share that. Because what happens normally is, you know, an urgent strategy group would be called, and you haven't got those same central people being involved. So for me, it's about having a much more of a known group that meets regularly to almost preempt things as well as acting in a reactionary way. That's been really good. People have been much more available because a lot of us have been working at home. Teams has become our new social life, really. So that's been really positive. So I think moving forward is to hang on to those things that have worked really well. And it's there is we can't go back to working in little pockets and little islands again. We have to keep this multi-agency approach because it does work and brings the best outcomes for children. So that's why.